This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to Roots and All, where I dig deep into the world of plants, people, the planet, and this week it's the turn of trees. Specifically, I'm exploring how you can incorporate trees into crops. I'm joined by Andy Dibben, co-author of Silvohorticulture, to explain how agroforestry can transform our growing spaces, blending trees with horticulture for a more resilient and productive future.
Me and a friend of mine, Ben Raskin, have written a book called Silvohorticulture. And essentially it's a book, there's a lot of talk in all circles at the moment about agroforestry, but a lot of the focus generally is around mixing trees with arable crops or mixing trees with livestock. And as a commercial vegetable farmer, I have focused on talking about integrating trees with vegetable crops and fruit crops. But we think the book really applies anyone who grows vegetables on any scale. The book is targeted at all different scales. And, you know, the principles we talk about in the book really can be applied from a massive farm to a small garden and everything in between.
Excellent. So can you explain what agroforestry is, just in case someone's not aware?
So agroforestry, in the simplest terms, it's nothing new. It's an ancient technique of basically mixing trees into food production areas. You know, traditionally, often these days, an orchard is seen as somewhere you grow fruit separately to a different part of your garden where you grow vegetables. In fact, if you look at the historical record, people have often mixed these very much with each other and grown vegetable crops underneath trees, or allowed livestock to actively graze underneath trees that are producing food as well. So it's mixing tree crops with edible crops on the ground.
And would it always be a productive tree, or could it be a tree that's got a benefit of something other than food production?
It can certainly be other things other than food production. You know, commonly it is some of the most common versions of what we're talking about are food production, but in particular with silvohorticulture, so integrating trees into vegetable production, there are so many other benefits you can gain from your trees other than just another edible crop.
So, I mean, the concept, as you said, you could use it on a domestic setting, you can use it at a commercial scale, presumably. And the principle behind it is that you underplant trees with other productive crops. And I think anyone that's listening who's got trees or sort of works around trees might immediately think, oh, well, that's a novel concept, because, you know, traditionally under trees, you've got things like lack of nutrients, lack of water. And this is a big question because I know it's going to depend on what sort of trees you're talking about. But essentially, is there a misnomer around growing trees and then underplanting them with stuff in the horticultural community? Because, as I said, we've got this preconceived idea that actually things don't necessarily grow well under trees.
I would confidently say that it is a misnomer, but both the things you mentioned there, Sarah, about interaction between the trees and the crops around water and nutrients, there is the potential for there to be competition, but if managed correctly, those things can also bring benefits to each other. So trees actually aid water infiltration into the ground. So if you're in a very, very dry, hot summer and you get a downpour of rain, you might well be keen for that water to soak into your ground, and tree roots in the ground actually help to boost soil health and therefore help water to soak into the ground, but they also help that soil around your vegetable plants to hang on to that moisture as well. But you're correct. If you pick the wrong tree and put it in the wrong place, it can steal water and nutrients from your vegetable crops. So it's important to manage that interaction carefully. We go to great lengths in the book to essentially, the book is all about designing a system where your trees and your vegetable crops interact in what I'd call a symbiotic way, rather than a way that is negative to each other. But there is potential for negative interactions, so it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah, and you do mention at the beginning of the book that trees, as you say, can maximise the water retention and the nutrient retention of the soil. And again, you cover that in depth in the book, but just broadly speaking, how might that happen?
Well, an example from trees and soil health is that underneath trees, you have often, because it's so untouched, the soil underneath the tree and around its roots, the most amazing soil health is allowed to develop. So, it's never been cultivated or dug over or had loads of crops growing in it. And actually, the fungal populations, the bacterial populations, and all those things that give you a really vibrant soil health tend to be, especially fungal populations, tend to be massively boosted and increased by the presence of trees.
And I think you mentioned as well that trees are kind of effective at the soil level, at the ground level, and at the above ground level. And that is for a number of reasons. But how could a tree benefit the crops, say, at a pest management level?
Well, that's a particular passion of mine now. And I'm an organic vegetable farmer, so I use every available technique to help me with what we call natural pest management. So that's managing pests without having to reach for any kind of chemicals or products to help us do it. And in simple terms, that's about enhancing the natural biodiversity within your garden or on your farm or, in your large estate. And trees are a fantastic way of providing habitat to all kinds of life. If I give you a couple of examples, ladybirds, adult ladybirds absolutely love to overwinter in trees, in curled up leaves at the bottom of the trees, in the bark, in the nooks and crannies, in the branches and on the trunk. I've been out today pruning my apple trees all day, and almost every tree, if I look close enough, I'll find adult ladybirds in amongst the bark. Now, these ladybirds, when we come to spring, will move away from the trees and into my vegetable crops. And the adults themselves like to eat a lot of aphids, but their babies in particular eat thousands of aphids. And then if we go a bit bigger, something like a blue tit, so a blue tit nesting in a tree, one baby blue tit in a nest will eat, if it's close to fledging, can eat up to 100 caterpillars in a day. You'll often have 10 chicks in a nest. So that's 1,000 caterpillars in a day. And as any experienced veg gardener knows, cabbage white butterflies can be a particular challenge. And yeah, anything that hoovers up caterpillars from your brassicas is a friend to the vegetable producer.
And on that topic, obviously the trees are harbouring and providing habitat for lots of diverse creatures, but thinking about the invertebrates, for example, is it the case that obviously they're providing a habitat for the beneficial insects, but on the other side of the coin, are they providing a habitat for things that aren't maybe not so desirable?
What we find on the farm where I grow organic veg is it's really important. If you want all the beneficials, you have to have some of their food source around all the time. So we never aim, whether it be, we have polytunnels, glass houses, big outdoor growing areas. I grow on about 15 acres of veg. So we actually want to see low levels of aphids or caterpillars around most of the time, because that means there's a food source that attracts the predators. So we're never looking for no pests. We're looking for pests at a level that don't cause us any commercial damage. So a little bit of nibbling on a Brussels sprout plant isn't a problem. A Brussels sprout plant stripped to its bare frame is a problem. But we find by being tolerant and providing habitats and allowing there to be a food source for predators, it really, really works. And yeah, that's when the real magic of kind of organic growing happens, is when you hit that point where you can be tolerant and you have enough habitat, there's essentially a thriving ecosystem around your crops, but all over your crops as well.
I've got a note here on my questions for you, and it says that on page 39 of the book, it says that you grow wild cherry, elder, and spindle near your crop areas. And my question is, why those species? What are they achieving?
In our system here, we grew a mix of trees for different objectives, essentially. We had many objectives. The biggest objective for us with our trees was to reduce wind speeds in the cropping areas. But essentially, any tree will create a windbreak. So after that, we're like, well, what else can we get from our trees? And we grew, there's 100 apple trees in the system, and obviously they're for providing us with apples, which we can eat and sell. There are hazels and alders, which we are going to coppice on a 5-year cycle. And that's for wood chip for our garden, both for pathways, but also we produce compost out of wood chip. And the cherries, the spindle, and the elder you ask about, They are specifically, we will never harvest anything from those trees. We will never cut those trees down. They are specifically picked to be a habitat for beneficial insects. And the reason we chose them is they are, when we talk about attracting predators into our cropping areas, really, it's nothing fancy or new. All we're trying to do is to bring all the life that's currently in the hedge on the edge of the field, and that's where all the predators will be. We're trying to bring it out into the middle of the field. So where we've got cherry trees and elder and spindle out in the middle of the field, those are also the trees that are in our woodlands and in our hedgerows. So we're essentially just bringing that wildlife habitat out into the middle of the field. And those trees in particular, because they were trees that naturally grow in the area and thrived on our soil type, and we knew would do very well.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually another one of my questions was, why do you need to mix them in between the crops? Why not just have them on the boundaries? Is that an issue because, a lot of insects just don't travel that far?
That's exactly right. I mean, I think if you look at sort of really advanced agricultural research, what they will tell you is that a predatory insect has a maximum range of 50 meters from a complex habitat. So if you're in a small garden, you can have a nice wild corner in the corner of your garden, and that'll be really effective. Obviously, the more habitat you can have in the garden, the more effective it's going to be. But if you've got a large garden or a large estate, or for me, I've got large fields, it's important to bring those wildlife corridors right in amongst my crops. And that's what allows things like beetles and birds and predatory insects to kind of move from the hedgerows and the edges of the fields right into the middle of my fields. But the same approach can be applied to any sized garden.
I mean, everybody at the moment is looking to increase the biodiversity of their site, or hope they are. It is very much a hot topic, but is this more than just an exercise in biodiversity box ticking? Can it have an economic benefit?
100%. I mean, some of the other things, as I mentioned with the system we did, we were interested in reducing wind speeds. Now, vegetables can be very prone to wind. You can increase, whether it be for your own table at home, or it's for providing a large house that you're gardening for, or whether it's for taking off and selling at market. Reducing wind speeds will increase your yields, and it will increase the volume of vegetables you can grow, but it will also crucially increase the quality of vegetables. Often that wind burn can just take the shine off your chard and your spinach leaves, give you a little bit of tip burn on lettuces and things like that. And just by reducing, whether it be like hot, dry winds in the summer or very cold winds early in the spring, by dropping those wind speeds, you can increase the quality and the yields of your crops as well. The same goes with shade. We've all now somewhere in the country experienced a very, very hot summer. For us here, it was 2022, and I think our thermometers touched 39 degrees on the hottest days. Now, interestingly, there's another misnomer here that many, many veg gardeners believe that almost all their veg would prefer blazing sunshine all day long. And it's something we talk about a lot in the book. That's just simply not the case, actually. Most vegetable crops don't like the really long, hot, dry days of summer. They quite like a lot of sunshine, but not all day long. They'll quite often be happy with like 2/3 of the day of sunshine, and actually grow better if they go into shade for a little bit of the day. And how you manage the shade cast by that tree is another, a relatively complicated area about how big the tree is, where the tree is placed in relationship to your vegetables. But again, we go into a lot of detail in the book about how what we call design a system. And that might be just where you place one tree or where you place multiple trees. And if you look towards the Mediterranean, it's a technique that's often used now. People will grow salad crops underneath trees, provide dappled shade to, if your lettuces are in full sunshine in August, they will be much smaller and run to seed much, much quicker than if they were in dappled shade. You've also got the fact that dappled shade will cool the ground and reduce evaporation of water. So if we ever put on hose pipe bans, having veg in the middle of the summer in a nice little bit of shade will also massively reduce your water usage as well.
If you're designing this kind of system, then, in my head, I'm thinking we're designing these two things in tandem. We're designing the underplanting and also designing the tree planting plan at the same time. But if you had an existing orchard, is it something that you could then underplant?
It certainly is. And a lot of this would depend on what size the trees were. But if you've got an existing orchard, almost certainly you're going to be able to get in underneath them. Something else you just have to be aware of is how close the trees are together and where the roots of those apple trees are. Now, one option is to deep mulch. A lot of gardeners these days are into no-dig growing. But you've got to be a little bit careful if you're doing a no-dig system about the tree roots migrating into your vegetable beds. And that's something else that we talk about in the book, which is something called root pruning. So especially with a young tree, you can prune the roots off a tree. With an older tree, you want to be a little bit more careful. So I think if your orchard area at home had fairly well spaced out trees, then you could definitely have vegetable beds in between them. It's something that used to be very common in Kent amongst the orchards towards the beginning of the 1900s. It was a very common technique, was growing vegetables up between the rows of apple trees. Another really good example is it doesn't have to be vegetables. It can be, well, it doesn't have to be annual vegetables. You could be talking about perennial vegetables. And in fact, things like soft fruit bushes and rhubarb, they all thrive in the shade. It's almost their natural environment is to be in the shade underneath trees.
And actually, that's a good point, thinking about the sort of shape of existing trees. And that leads on to maybe issues as your trees get bigger. Are you potentially going to have a problem with literally getting underneath them to harvest or to maintain your crops? And the other thing I guess I would think about would be if things were dropping off of my trees, like branches, fruit, for example, that didn't get picked. How do you overcome those issues? Do you have to be careful about what you plant quite close to the tree?
That is definitely something that's it needs close consideration. And that's, that comes in lots of different forms. It might just be leaves in autumn dropping into the middle of your lettuces. And these are all things that can be managed. You'll when autumn starts to arrive, it might be a case you just put a little bit of crop mesh or fleece over the lettuces under the tree. It might be that you do have to pick a bit more of an effort to pick all the apples off the tree rather than just let them fall at random onto your vegetables. Or it might be that you plan to have cropped the vegetables underneath the tree, and you can plan where you plant your vegetables accordingly. And again, that's something we go into great length about in the book. Technically, it's often called phasing, and that is whether it be to allow you to physically reach the tree to do the harvest, or whether it be about planning your cropping so that apples don't fall on your lettuces or damage your broccolis or things like that. That's quite important. But also, you can manage that interaction by the choice of tree, and especially in a smaller garden where you're going to be limited on space. One of the key techniques to be using is, especially if you're going for a fruit tree, is going to be choice of rootstock. So you can get a lot of the benefits of having a tree next to your vegetables. The biodiversity benefits, a little bit of shade, but this could all be done on a dwarfing rootstock. And then you're not. It's not going to be so invasive into a small area, but it's going to provide many of the benefits around soil health and biodiversity still as well, and that what we call three-dimensional cropping. So being able to have using the vertical space in a small area in a more efficient way for food production.
And I know it's something you go into in the book, but I would like to get your take on it, even, if it's just briefly. There's a lot of different ideas around establishing trees successfully, but how might you go about that?
I'm definitely a treat them mean, keep them keen. So I'm not that big on digging lovely, great big comfortable holes for my trees at planting. I tend to do, I tend to try and buy my trees as bare root trees. So they'll come with no soil on them, just bare roots. And I always try and plant them on the day they arrive, if that's possible. And they go straight into the ground. If it's nice, healthy soil, I'll just literally make a slot in the ground and plant them straight in. If it was a slightly bigger tree, like an apple tree or something like that, I might dig a bit more of a pit, but I try and avoid mixing too much nice compost into the hole. And we find that if we just we dig the hole out, size of the roots of the tree, put the tree in the hole and then fill it back with the same soil, those roots are then encouraged to spread further and wider and not stay. Essentially, if you fill the hole with lovely compost, it's kind of mollycoddling them a bit. and the roots don't want to go outside the hole you dug. And then you actually end up with not a very sturdy tree because the roots haven't wanted to go very far. So we tend to just put the same soil back in the hole. But then what I'm a massive fan of is a really good mulching around the base of the tree at planting. And we aim to put, 30 centimetre deep pile of mulch. And probably you're talking about 60 centimetres across or a bit more. And that naturally the worms will take that down into the soil and start feeding that tree with that mulch. That mulch will also take care of your initial weed control around the tree. And we find if you put on a really deep mulch, so 30 centimeters deep and nice and wide, that one mulch at the very beginning is enough to establish that tree and get it away very healthily.
Excellent. Thank you for that. You mentioned in the book that rather than seeing increased yields in the long term, all you're doing really is maintaining yields because our growing conditions are becoming more challenging, which is, I think you say is due to climate change. And it just made me think, are we at a point where we're kind of running to stand still in horticulture at the moment?
As a commercial food producer, I really don't mix my words on this subject. Every year, in 2022, like I said, we had 39 degrees centigrade here. I'm based in Gloucestershire. I'm not down in Cornwall in the balmy Riviera. So we normally get pretty cold winters and a fair bit of rain. And yeah, I think we had no rain for 14 weeks, and it got to 39 degrees centigrade. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to change all my crop plan for the following year and start to adjust things for the extreme heat we're now going to get every year. And then ironically, in 2023 and 2024, it barely stopped raining for 24 months. So the weather extremes are becoming more and more intense. And I don't think anything's going to go back to normal at any point. And we need to be building, definitely as farmers, we're all that the buzzword of the moment in all of farming is climate resilience and changing the way we produce our crops. But I'd say exactly the same applies to gardens. And our gardens or our farms need to be able to cope with intense rainfall and potential flooding, extreme droughts, and very, very high wind storms, and possibly all three of them in a week. So, and I definitely think that trees are a really useful tool for achieving that. As I've spoken through the interview, whether that's about casting some shade, whether that's about keeping the ground fractured to absorb water, or just boosting soil health. There's lots of ways you can do this. And all gardeners will know which of these extreme effects of climate change their particular garden is most vulnerable to. There's something we emphasize a lot in the book is, in many ways, what we don't do in the book is tell everyone to do exactly this with their trees and their garden. We're trying to teach people all the different things you could achieve with a tree and which situations might be best for which tree or which design. So we're really trying to knowledge up gardeners and farmers to design their own systems to specifically deal with their own unique gardens. If you've got a garden on the north coast of Cornwall, you're going to have a lot of problems with wind. If you've got a garden on the banks of the River Severn, somewhere near Tewkesbury, you've probably got major problems with flooding. So the trees can help to alleviate all the problems from these things. Not always stop them happening, but quite often help your garden to recover after an extreme event.
I sometimes think as gardeners and growers, we can be a little bit hamstrung by our received wisdom that's been passed down to us. And I really like that fact that you're experimenting. And like you said, it's got to be site specific. You've got to find out what works for you. Do you think sometimes we just need a little bit more confidence to try stuff out?
It's very interesting you say that, Sarah. I train apprentices here at the farm in organic horticulture. And there's a phrase that I always use, which is, they say many things. And that when I say they say, I definitely, up until about 10 years ago, still had lots of wise words of wisdom on gardens from my aunt and my mum, which are essentially quite Victorian approaches to horticulture. Now, many of these things have now been proven to be not true, whether it be pruning techniques or one of the classic things we discovered right in the book was the shape of roots of a tree. I always thought roots had a big tap root that went straight down, and kind of their roots were shaped in a nice round ball under the tree. Turns out that's very, very few trees have deep tap roots. Most trees are incredibly shallow rooting. So that's why it's important to manage their roots. But yeah, I think it's, with the advances in science and so many people being into crop production or gardening now, our knowledge moves on at a rapid rate. And I think many of the considered norms have been proven not to be correct. So it's always good to keep up to date with the latest thinking.
Very big thanks to Andy for the excellent interview, and to Andy and Ben for their groundbreaking research. And thanks as always to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 235 Wood Chip with Ben Raskin and 137 with Dr. Glyn Percival. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.